Megan Kramer here. I am now joined by Dr. Brian Jordan, who is the Deputy Executive Director for the Kansas Association of School Boards. And we are going to talk about an issue that I know are on many members' minds right now, which is K-12 education. Brian, thanks for joining us first of all. Can you provide an overview of just where we are in Kansas right now because of the coronavirus? I know there's been confusion, and I'm sure you guys are getting lots of questions, fielding lots of Zoom calls and meetings as well, but just kind of give us an overview of what we know right at this moment.
You bet. As you all are probably aware, schools have been closed in the state of Kansas, but schools being closed does not mean we're not providing education and supports for kids. Last week, the governor announced that she was closing schools in response to the coronavirus, and that was effective. Last week, we spent the whole week going in and cleaning schools, doing a deep clean. This week, district administration, boards, and staff are working on what the state is calling the continuous learning plans. What the continuous learning plans are is simply the district's approach or what they're going to do to provide educational supports and services for kids through the end of the month of May. And so those services and supports are supposed to start up next week, the week of March 30th, with districts providing those. And so you can imagine the challenges that entails when you start thinking about the diversity of districts across the state of Kansas. We have the smallest districts in the state have less than 60 kids in them. Well, the largest one has over 40,000 students in it. So districts right now are kind of in the planning phases. We do have just a few districts out there that have started to provide some instructional supports. We have many districts out there in the state that are providing food service for kids. And so that is something that districts all started almost immediately with last week when the order came down to close the schools. I believe that was on Monday. Then the schools were closed Monday. Districts started trying to feed families as best as they could. Cleaning started to happen. And so now the scramble is, how do we get back to providing some educational supports? Even though the physical buildings have been closed, how do we provide educational opportunities going forward?
So let's speak to parents right now. What are realistic goals for parents to have in mind?
One of the things that the State Department of Education did as a response to this closure is they assembled what they called a task force for continuous learning. And that task force was comprised of about 40 or 50 educators from teachers all the way up to superintendents from around the state. And they put out some guidance on what continuous learning could look like in our communities across Kansas. In that guidance, you'll repeatedly see there's an emphasis on less is more when it comes to homework and tasks and assignments. In that guidance, they're asking staff members and teachers to really be intentional about what they think kids need to know and be able to do at the end of this school year to have success as school starts next year. In that guidance also, you'll find there's some parameters that they provide as far as the amount of time that kids should be spending on school-related tasks based on the age of the students. So, you know, at the kindergarten through first grade levels, it's a very small amount of time. When you get up to the high school grade levels, I believe their guidance is somewhere around 30 minutes per teacher per day. So you take a high school kid, it's a freshman or sophomore, they're going to be, you know, doing 30 minutes of time per teacher per day. So they're going to have several hours of work that they should be focused on to try to stay on track with where they were when school closed previously. From a parent standpoint, there is absolutely no way, given the short amount of time that we've had to plan, for us to replace what was going to occur between mid-March and the middle of May. This continuous learning guidance that's been given is our best attempt around the state to provide support for kids and try to keep kids moving and progressing with their education, but by no means is it going to be of the same quality that we would have been able to provide if kids would have been in school in the actual physical buildings for that period of time. There's some pretty dynamic things I know that teams have been working on in those plans, but we're asking parents to understand these are uncharted waters. Nobody has ever dealt with something like this on the scale that we're dealing with. We've had schools maybe be damaged by a storm or fire and had to, hold school in a different location, but we could still put kids together with the teacher in those locations. We can't physically put more than 10 people in a space. And so that's a challenge that schools are trying to work through. We're asking for parents to be partners with their schools and with their students and their teachers as we try to deliver those services.
Well, what's your message to educators too? Because I'm sure they're anxious to get going and get back in contact with their students. And I'm sure they're,
Yeah, it's been pretty amazing to hear. We've been meeting daily with superintendents, with school officials, with school personnel, talking about plans, talking about adjustments that are going to have to be made with policy and procedures and laws. And overwhelmingly, educators are eager to get back and work with their kids. And the message has been from the State Department as well as us, take your time and develop some solid supports. Don't rush into something that you can't deliver on, because that's just going to create more agitation and more ill will towards the schools. In other words, don't bite off more than you can actually physically do. And that, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do the most you can, but be realistic about the constraints that we have. And I know technology is one of those constraints based on Kansas, and I grew up out in north central Kansas. And I know the challenges, and in my job, I travel to districts that, internet access is not the norm for a lot of families in some of our communities. And so there's some things that districts are having to try to figure out related to how to deliver that service or how to deliver that education, maybe in the absence of technology that would make things a little bit easier. So the message to educators is don't overthink it, don't overplan it. Try to get some good solid resources into families' hands, either in paper or print, or if they have the technology, try to get it to them via technology.
Yeah, that leads right into my next question, which is, as obviously you're aware, depending on where they might be at in the state, their access to internet, sometimes even a computer, isn't always what we would hope it would be. So what are some things you're hearing from school districts on how they're trying to manage that?
That's probably the largest issue that we're hearing. Again, I met with a group of school leaders today and posed the question. We're trying to figure out how we can continue to support them. Their biggest challenge right now is the gap in technology that they're experiencing in their communities. It's not only a gap from a student and learning standpoint, it's a gap sometimes in a communications standpoint. Schools have, they're gearing their communications towards online platforms such as Facebook, websites, different apps that push information out. We have families that maybe don't have devices or internet access to access that information. And if the kids aren't showing up every day to get the written note from the school to carry home to the parents, how do we get that information to the parents? And, phone calls are great, but sometimes people don't want to pick up their phone for whatever reason. And so it's really put a strain on the system to have the disparity that we do with the technology around the state. And you just start to realize how much we rely on kids to carry a note home, or, something to physically be printed and handed to somebody, or meeting with a group of parents. And all those things have gone away. We've had to switch to the digital means. We do have some districts that have done phone campaigns where they're just physically calling every single family to see what their needs are and see what their technology capabilities are. And that's been pretty effective. But we still have a percentage of families out there that are hard to reach, or that it's going to be difficult to provide a high quality service to because of that gap that's there.
I thought about that. So I'm in Manhattan, and they sent a survey out, and then I thought, well, what about for those that don't have email or so? I wondered if they called them.
Exactly. I talked with the superintendent today about that very thing. He said, we started to put together this survey to push out. We were going to post it on our website and push it out, and then the realization came, well, what if somebody doesn't have any of these platforms? How are they going to respond to this survey? So they had to rethink how to approach that. And that is one of the barriers or challenges that districts are facing right now.
So some of the smaller districts, I think it's maybe easier, but.
One of the districts that I heard from this week, they have about 300 students. They were able to just tell their staff, take these 10 kids, make personal contact via phone with these families, to get these questions answered. And then, within 2 days, they had all their families contact and have that information collected. Now, when you go to a district of 10,000 kids or 5,000 kids, that task becomes a little more difficult.
So are state assessments waived for this year?
As of today, what the guidance has been from the federal level, the state assessments are a mandate from our federal government as part of Every Student Succeeds Act. Betsy DeVos, who is the Secretary of Education at the federal level, has begun the conversation of how states can apply for a waiver from the state assessments. And our Commissioner of Education, Dr. Randy Watson, has indicated that state assessments will be canceled for this year. And simply because of the logistics of trying to administer them, they cannot be administered via an online platform. They have to be given in person or with a person proctoring. The assessment is actually online, but it can't be given without a proctor present. And so by the very nature of how we're trying to provide continuous learning for kids, we're not going to be able to do the state assessments this year, so they will be canceled for this year.
So my next question was about how are we going to follow open meeting requirements? And I think it was Derek Schmidt sent out some information and we shared that. Do you have anything that you would recommend besides what they sent out?
No, just to abide by what's there. A couple of reminders for our communities that are out there and the board members that are out there. COMA requires that school boards make their business public. And so the community has a right to hear the business of the board. We have some districts that have really kind of gotten hung up on how do we make it interactive with the board. And the law does not say that you have to make the meeting interactive with your public. The public simply needs to be able to hear the business of the board. And so that's relieved some stress for school boards that are out there. So we have some districts that are doing some different things with Facebook Live or with Zoom and making the meeting accessible, but turning off the features where people will interact directly with the board while they're conducting their meeting. We're telling boards to make sure that they communicate openly with their public around how their meeting structure will potentially change because of the restrictions on no more than 10 people in a space. But we're telling boards you need to get a special board meeting scheduled here in the next week to 10 days. Local boards are going to be required to have a waiver approved for their continuous learning plan and submitted to the Kansas State Department by April 8th. And so they need to have a special board meeting here within the next 10 days to get that done. The planning work is happening currently to get the plan developed, but the board has to sign off on that before it goes to the State Department of Education on April 8th. Your public needs to be informed of what's going on. Make sure you're trying to communicate as best as you can of how that meeting structure is going to change and make sure that your community knows where they can access that information to hear about the business of the board currently.
Do you have anything you want to add that I didn't ask?
I would add, this is a real opportunity for us to think about what we've traditionally done in education in Kansas and really try to figure out, are there things that we can learn from this situation that will continue to improve our education going into the future. I think we're going to learn some things of how to reach families, how to differentiate our instruction and our support that we're providing kids. I think we're going to learn some things in this environment that we're in. I think our response in Kansas from our educators, our teachers, our principals, our boards, and our superintendents has been amazing. They got handed a pretty tough task a little over a week ago, and I think they've responded great by stepping up and figuring out how do we make the best possible experience that we can for kids given the constraints that we know we're facing.
Well, we are all learning as we get through this. So
that is absolutely right. As we keep telling people, this is stuff they write about in the history books.